Okay, so first things first, I will say I am not a professional photographer. I don't even take pictures of many cosplayers because I'm actually rubbish at taking pictures of people. However, yeah, I'm an amateur photographer, just like you guys. I have probably about 4 or 5 years of experience in taking pictures now and using DSLRs. So I might say things that people don't agree with. And the techniques that I've learned are purely through just using my camera. I had a manual SLR before I bought my digital one. I cut my teeth with an Olympus OM10 and a Praktika. So essentially the techniques that I use, they work, but they might not necessarily be the recommended way of doing things. What I'm going to talk about today are the absolute basics of how an SLR works and the relationships between the different things that an SLR uses in order to figure out how to expose your picture correctly. So this might maybe even be a bit too basic for some people, but I hope it is of some use. First things first, in order to get an idea of what kind of level of photographers I have here at the panel today, what I would like you all to do is to get your camera out and then put it on all the settings you would do if you were going to take a picture without actually turning the camera on. Fantastic. Okay, so let's have a wee look and see what we've got. Sorry, I said I wasn't going to move.
Right now, I'm probably one of these stupid noobs that only use P.
Okay, no, you're on P mode there. So that's, yeah.
No settings.
No settings at all, right, okay. So are you thinking of buying a camera? Not yet. So you're just here to just because you're interested. Cool, okay. Let's see what we've got here. Okay, cool. Okay.
I've only got compact, but
You're thinking of getting one?
Yeah, I do also play with some of the ISO settings.
Oh, right, okay. That's fine. Custom 3, okie dokie.
Already probably a lot better than most of us.
Sorry, we just got started, but come and have a seat. Okay. Right, so that gives me a fairly good idea of kind of what level everybody's sort of at. So we're kind of at the sort of, I want to kind of have a play with my settings, but I'm not entirely sure what's the best setup for taking a picture. So what we'll go over today is just a couple of things about like your mode dial, the different options on your mode dial and what they do, things like that. We'll talk about some ballpark settings for your camera if you want to get started with using your camera in manual mode and having a bit more control over it. I can talk a bit about lens purchasing and things like that. If you have any questions, just ask away, it's totally fine. If I can't answer it, I'll let you know. So first things first, SLR cameras are complicated, okay? There's a lot of bits in them. The way in which they work, however, is fairly simple. This is a dissected Pentax camera, and you can see all the little nuts and bolts and screws and things in there. But actually, the way that they work is fairly straightforward. So this is the innards of your SLR in a very sort of simple diagrammatical format, okay? So the light enters through your camera lens, okay? You've got an aperture here in the middle, okay? This is kind of like the iris of your eye. It will open or close to let in more light if it's more open, or to prohibit more light if it's more shut, okay? So you've got that, you've got your mirror, okay? The mirror is what distinguishes SLR cameras from other cameras because what you see is what you get straight through the lens, okay? The mirror blocks the way to the shutter, which is what is in front of your sensor, which actually registers the light and takes your picture, okay? So when you are composing your shot, you're looking through your viewfinder, you've got loads of little prisms and mirrors and things in here that will bounce the light around and then off the central mirror in front of the lens so that you can see what's going on. But when you actually press the shutter button, what will happen is that the mirror will lift up, okay? So that click that you hear when you take a photo with your SLR camera is the sound of the mirror going up. Okay, and then the shutter here, there's a little curtain in front of your sensor. It will draw back for a certain amount of time and then close again. So it's the exposing of your sensor to the light by lifting up the mirror and opening the shutter curtain that gives you a picture. Okay, so even though they're actually quite complicated in terms of their innards, the way in which they work is fairly straightforward. So we're going to talk about the different bits of your camera now. So you've got your aperture, as I said before, it's like the iris of your eye, okay? So the terminology that we use is stopping down and stopping up, okay, with regards to your aperture. And the reason for that is because when you have a lens, your aperture works in clicky stops like that, okay? So the lower your number on your lens, okay, it'll show up in the viewfinder of your camera if you've got a digital SLR, it'll say F whatever, okay? So a low F number means that your aperture is more open, so it's letting in more light, okay? But if you have a higher F number, then that means that the aperture is more closed, it's letting in less light, and therefore your shot's going to be darker. Okay, everyone with me so far? So aperture determines how much light actually reaches your inside of your camera. Okay. Next, we've got the shutter. As I said before, it's a curtain across the camera. So if you think about if you shut your eyes and then open your eyes for a brief moment and then shut them again. Okay, the shutter is what determines how much light actually reaches your camera. Okay, so you'll have X amount of light coming through the aperture and onto your sensor, but it's the shutter that determines how long that sensor is actually exposed to light for. So that's measured in fractions of a second. Okay, so the bigger the number underneath the 1, the quicker your shutter is closing. Okay. So it will open for a brief fraction of a second and then shut again. Obviously, if you have a very long shutter speed, then the shutter's going to be open for a long time. You're going to get lots of light coming in, and therefore you're going to get a brighter shot. Okay? So that's the shutter. And then lastly, you've got the ISO. Okay? Now this is actually something that's determined by the sensitivity of your sensor to light. Okay? And you can change that when you're operating your camera. Okay, this is not a mechanical setting, it's a digital setting. Okay, so you have to do it by going into the menu of your camera, etc. So back in the days of film, you used to get 100, 200 and 400 speed film. Okay, so what that essentially means is that if you have a higher speed film, then your camera is going to be more sensitive to light. Okay, if you've got a lower speed film, then it's going to be less sensitive to light, and ISO is exactly the same. Okay, so if you have a low ISO, you're going to need a lot of light reaching your sensor in order to actually register the details, because it's not that sensitive. Whereas if you have a high ISO, you don't need a huge amount of light to register all those details. So if you're working in dark conditions, like you're at the masquerade or something like that, then you're going to want to put your ISO up a little bit, because then that way you're making use of the little light that you have available. Okay? So the way in which we measure ISO is relative to 100, okay? So this is a little bit complicated to explain because of the mathematics, but basically 200 ISO is equivalent to twice as much sensitivity as 100 ISO, okay? So if you're going up to 1600 ISO, then that's going to be 16 times more sensitive to light compared to 100 ISO, okay? So 100 is kind of the baseline, really. Everyone with me so far? Is that all good? That all makes sense, okay? So basically, your camera is dependent on these settings in order to expose your shot, okay? So how bright or how dark your shot is will depend on what you set these settings for, okay? So that's that side of things, and now I'm going to go over the mode dial, okay? Because there's a lot of different acronyms on there, there's a whole bunch of different settings that you can choose from, and a lot of the time you just kind of think, well, why can't I just use the one, okay? So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what they do and why you would use them, okay? I have a Pentax, so the mode settings are a little bit weird, but I'll just go over all of them anyway. So green mode, it's where I don't know what I'm doing, please set all of my settings for me, I'm not too sure, okay? Either that, or I just want to get this picture and I don't give a shit what settings you do, I just need the picture now, okay? So that's green mode, okay? It's fine when you're starting out, but you bought this camera because you want to use it to its full capacity. So ideally you want to get off green mode at some point, okay? P mode, which is what a lot of people here have selected, is like a customizable green mode, okay? So the way that P works is basically your camera will select your settings for you, but they are a suggestion. And you can then go on to change those individual settings according to whether you're happy with the shot or not. So you can take a picture in P mode and think, oh, it's a little bit too dark, don't really like that. And then you can modify your shutter or your aperture to compensate, okay? P mode works slightly differently according to which brand of camera you have, okay? In some cases you don't have that customizability and you have to go into a different mode in order to actually change it. So it really does depend on what brand you have. SV, okay. So SV is sensitivity value, so that sets your ISO, right? So you set the ISO, you say, right, okay, I really want a nice quality picture, I don't want it to be really grainy, I'll set it to a nice low ISO of about 200 or something like that. And your camera will then go, right, okay, I'm stuck at this ISO, I have to make the most of this much light, I will set this aperture and this shutter speed. Okay, so that's what sensitivity mode does, okay? a lot of people kind of think, well, what's the point of really having that? Like a lot of DSLR cameras don't even have that as an option. Like in some cases, I think it's actually a Pentax specific thing. But under those circumstances, if you really don't want any grainy noise in your picture, okay, I'll talk a bit more about that later, but if you really wanted a nice quality picture that wasn't really grainy, then you would use that setting. Okay, so that's that. TV is time value, okay, it's sometimes set as S on other brands of camera. You might have an S button on your mode dial, and that'll be this one here, okay? So that sets, you set the shutter speed, so you say, right, okay, this person's running along, I want a really fast shutter speed so that I can catch them without having any motion blur, okay? So you set the shutter speed to, I don't know, 1/400 of a second or something along those lines, and then your camera will go, right, okay, the shutter is going to be open for X amount of time, I'm going to have this amount of light, I'll set the ISO to this value and the aperture to this value. Okay? So basically most of these mode dials are setting one thing and the camera does the rest. Okay? Aperture value is exactly the same thing, so AV mode, you set the aperture, you say I want this much light to actually enter the camera in the first instance. Say for instance you've got a nice sunset and you really want to bring out those rich colours, you might want to stop down your aperture quite a lot and make it quite narrow so that you get all of those rich colours coming through, and then you want your camera to set your shutter speed for you because it's quite dark and you're not quite sure how long it needs to be. Okay? So that's under the circumstances you would use aperture value. A lot of online photography tutorials tell you to go onto AV as your first port of call for getting off green mode. It really is up to you, doesn't really matter. Okay? So that's aperture value. And lastly, manual mode. Okay? I'm in charge, I know what settings I want, I'm going to set them. Okay? So ideally, we want you to be here at some point in the future, okay? Because it gives you more control over your shot, you can do exactly what you want to do, okay? B mode is not on all cameras, okay? That's the old bulb mode from the days of manual DSLRs, which is basically you depress the shutter button and the shutter will remain open for as long as it's pressed, okay? So back in the days when you had manual SLRs and you had cable release things, you just used to like depress the cable release and just kind of stand there, wait, count to 20, okay, I have a nice star trail, that's me done, okay? So it's when you use for astrophotography, night shots and things like that. Okay, it depends on how expensive the camera you have as to whether you have that option or not. Okay, so that is the mode dial, okay? All of these other bits and bobs here are all related to auto mode, okay? So, night shots, action, macro, etc. So all of those, again, are very similar to green mode, it's just that the camera will select slightly different settings for you. Is everyone happy with the mode dial? You all know what your mode dial does now. So that's that. So now I'm going to talk about the trade-offs between aperture, shutter speed and ISO, okay? So remember from before, aperture, you stop up to open your aperture and stop down to close it, okay? So that's a really narrow aperture and that's a really wide aperture, okay? So if your aperture is really wide, you've got lots of light entering your camera, your shot's going to be slightly brighter, okay? So this one, as you can see, is like a little bit whiter than this shot here, okay? I think I took that one at about f4. And that one was at about f12 or something like that. I took these a long time ago. But what I wanted to demonstrate here was what we call the depth of field effect, okay? So if you think about, if you look through a pinhole, if you just poke a hole in a bit of paper and have a look through it, everything will look slightly sharper, okay? And the reason for that is because you are constricting your field of view, okay? Now, whenever we use a lens, or even when we're looking through our own eyes, we've got slight aberrations in the corners of our field of view. And the reason for that is just because of the way that lenses are made. You get a little bit of barrel distortion or pincushion distortion depending on the type of lens you're using, okay? So if you narrow down your aperture, you are cutting out some of this distortion, and therefore you will get a slightly sharper shot as a result, okay? So if anyone's ever been to the opticians and the optician puts a little pinhole in front of your eye and asks if things look clearer, that's basically what they're doing. They're looking to see if they cut out all of those aberrations, does your vision get better, okay? So what happens when you have a wide aperture? Well, what will happen is the foreground shot that you're focusing on, right, what's in the foreground will be really sharp, really nicely in focus, but what will happen is that the background will be slightly blurred, okay? And so that's this depth of field effect. Things further away from you will be slightly soft focused as a result, okay? But if you stop down, if you close your aperture up a little bit, okay, what will happen is the background will become sharper, okay? So this is relevant to cosplay photography because if you have a big group of people and they're arranged in a slight semicircle, then the people that are closer are going to be more in focus than the people that are further back, okay? So what you're going to want to do, if you're doing a big group shot or something along those lines, is that you're going to want to have a fairly narrow aperture, okay, especially if you're shooting outdoors, in which case that will make everything nice and sharp, Okay, so every one of your settings has a slight trade-off. So with aperture, the trade-off is the depth of field. Okay, so the wider you have your aperture, the more light you have, but the background will also be slightly blurred, which is great for macro shots. Macro shots look brilliant at a wide aperture because you've got a beautiful, lovely in focus flower, and then in the background all of the grass and everything is nice and blurred, and so you've got a nice focal point. Okay, so you can use that to your advantage in your photography. Okay, if you have an individual subject and you want them to really stand out, then you can shoot to the wide aperture, get them to stand fairly far away from the background, and it'll be all nice and blurred, and your cosplay will be nice and in focus. Okay, so that's the way the aperture works. So you decrease your f number for more light and increase your f number for less light. Okay, so that's aperture. Moving on to shutter speed. Okay, so with shutter speed, the slower your shutter, so the longer it's open for, the more light you have. Okay, so if I took this shot here at 1/100, okay, and this one here was at 1/400. You can see the difference, okay? The background is really overexposed because it was a really bright sunny day, it was really bright outside, but I wanted to get all of these rock features nicely in focus, okay? But if I have a lower shutter speed, then you can see the beach in the background there, but my actual object that I wanted to have in focus is underexposed, it's dark, okay? So the faster you shutter, the shorter period it's open for, the less light gets to your sensor. Okay, that's basically the way it works. Okay. However, if you have a slow shutter speed, then you need to worry about camera shake and motion blur and things like that. Okay. So this is from an Ayacon a couple of years ago. What happened here was Nikki was dressed in a lovely costume from Trinity Blood, and she turned around just as I took the picture, okay? So, because the lighting in masquerades is pretty rubbish, you have to have a fairly low shutter speed, a wide open aperture, and a reasonably high ISO to get a decent picture, okay? So, the key to taking pictures at masquerades is to wait until they've stopped and are posing, okay? It is really, really hard to get decent pictures at the masquerade. Hats off to all the photographers who regularly shoot them, the likes of Nert and Foxy and so on, because it is really hard to do, okay? So if you have a low shutter speed, your shutter is open for longer, and therefore anything that moves during the time that your shutter is open is going to register as multiple points on your image, okay? So ideally you want to have a shutter speed where camera shake is less of an issue, okay? So anything above 160 is usually fairly okay. Okay? It depends on how steady your hand is as to how well you can actually hold the camera at a low shutter speed and get a good shot. Okay? There are anti-shake mechanisms built into your camera. Okay? Canons and Nikons have them built into the lenses, whereas Pentax is built into the body. Okay? So it really does depend on what camera you have as to how your anti-shake mechanism works. In Pentax, they actually vibrate the sensor rather than doing anything with the lenses and things like that. You had a question?
No, just saying that it's the same with Sony's as well.
Yeah, Sony's working the same way as Pentax do. So yeah, if you have a low shutter speed, you do have to worry about camera shake and things like that, and motion blur, etc. Okay. Lastly, ISO. So what I was talking about having a grainy image. This was the Botanical Gardens subway in Glasgow. That's actually come out a lot better on here than it has done on my laptop, but what basically happens is that if you have a really high ISO, okay, digital camera ISOs go up to some ridiculous amount. If you have like a 5D Mark II Canon, for example, it goes up to like 32,000 or something ridiculous like that. So you can ramp your ISO right up, but the trade-off is that you get more noise. So unfortunately, it hasn't shown up that great on here. This picture is actually really, really grainy. It's really noisy. Okay, you get little teeny tiny particles of grey in your picture when you have a high ISO. Okay, it's much the same in the days of film. If you had a 400 ISO film and you were taking pictures in the dark, then it would come out really grainy and really kind of like almost sort of ash spread across the front of your image. Noise is bad. It doesn't make for a great quality picture. Let's put it that way. Okay. Some people use it for artistic purposes. Black and white photographers use it quite a lot. You can get black and white film that goes up to like 1600 ISO and things like that. So yeah, it can be artistic at times, but for the most part, you don't really want a grainy picture, okay? So the lower your ISO, the better. Yes, it makes your camera less sensitive to light, so you need to have good lighting in order to get a properly exposed shot, but the quality of your actual image is going to be so much better compared to if you just ramp up the ISO. okay? Because you can actually register quite a lot of details at like 3200 ISO, which is what my camera goes up to, but the picture's shit. So it's really up to you. At the end of the day, if you're having to ramp up your ISO that much, consider getting a tripod, because then that way you can have a lower ISO, better quality image, without having to worry about camera shake and things like that, because you can just increase the shutter speed, open the aperture to compensate, okay? So putting up your ISO is the last thing you should do to improve the quality of your shot, because the minute you start going above 100 ISO, you are trading off between sensitivity and noise, okay? Is everyone happy with that explanation? So ideally you don't really want a grainy shot, it's not great, okay? So that's that. So in that case, if you wanted to venture onto M mode, what the hell settings should you use? Okay, so I'm just going to give you a couple of suggested priorities. There's no hard and fast rules, much the same as I was saying in the posing panel before. Okay, so with your aperture, start wide open. Okay, now the disadvantage of having the wide open aperture is the depth of field effect, as I was saying before. You do get a little bit of aberration as well. Okay, but if you stop down your aperture a lot, you will highlight every single bit of dust and debris on your sensor or in your lens, okay? So, for example, this lens that I've got here goes down to f22, okay? That's stopped down quite a lot. I'll pass it around actually, because if you have a look at it, a lot of digital SLR cameras will not actually stop down the aperture until the point where you take the picture. But because this is a manual focus lens, you can actually play with the aperture dial and you can actually see how narrow it is. There we go, just pass it around. So if you stop down too much, like if you go down to f22 or something like that, if your camera sensor is dirty, it will show up all of the debris and things like that. You should be getting your camera sensor cleaned at least, once every 2 years or so, okay? Because when you are changing lenses, you will get dust and dirt and things like that in your camera, okay? Most cameras do have a self-cleaning mechanism, but it's not always that great, okay? But yeah, if you stop down, all of that dust and dirt will show up if you're taking a photograph against a light surface. I've had quite a few landscape shots ruined by that, okay? So ideally you want to start wide open, because that's a nice starting point. You can always stop down, okay? Shutter speed, you want to stay above 150 or 160 to avoid camera shake. Again, it depends on how steady a hand you have, okay? And then ISO, the lower the better, okay? 100 is really what you want to have as much as possible, okay? You can get about 400 and not have too much noise, but if you start going above that, you will get a fairly noisy picture, okay? There's a lot of cameras that have inbuilt noise reduction and things like that, but as soon as you get it into Photoshop and start doing stuff to it, it will just show up like anything, okay? We could have a big discussion about shooting in RAW versus JPG, but I don't want to get into that just now. So those are your starting settings, right? So you're thinking, all right, okay, I'm outside, I've got this cosplayer here, I'd like to take a picture of them, okay? So have a go at that, and then you have a look at the picture you've taken, okay? So how's your shot? If it's too dark, then ideally you want to reduce your shutter speed first, okay? And then you want to increase your ISO. So remember, you've already started with your aperture wide open, so that's already your starting point for that sort of thing. So you can't open your aperture any wider, so you then move on to shutter speed, okay? So if you're having to reduce your shutter speed and it goes below 150, then ideally you want a tripod, okay? But if not, then increase your ISO, okay? So remember, ISO is your last resort. If it's too bright, then if your ISO isn't at 100, reduce it, okay? You always want to reduce your ISO first. Then, if it's still too bright, you then increase your shutter speed, so you want the shutter open for a shorter period of time so it lets in less light onto your sensor, okay? And then lastly, if all of those things you've done and it's still too bright, you then can start narrowing your aperture, okay? Generally, has anyone heard of the Sunny 16 rule? There's some photography books somewhere in the universe that's fairly well regarded said that if you are outdoors, your aperture ought to be around about f16, okay? That's just a ballpark, okay? Most of the outdoor shots I take are around about f8, f12 or thereabouts, okay? So it's really up to yourself, but really aperture is the last thing you want to be changing when you're reducing how overexposed your shot is, okay? So if your shot's too bright, you reduce your ISO until it's 100, then you increase your shutter speed so that you're getting less light being exposed to your sensor, and then lastly you narrow the aperture and reduce the amount of light coming into the camera, okay? As I said before, if you're reducing your aperture, you're getting lovely rich colours coming in, okay? So that's a nice thing to do if you're taking pictures of sunsets and things like that. So what you do will change according to your individual settings and so on. if you're happy with your shutter speed, so if your shutter speed is quite high, because it's bright outside, then you want to reduce your ISO, okay? So even if you're happy with your shot, ideally you want to be able to take the same shot with the lowest ISO you can, okay? And then after that, you narrow your aperture. So you're getting exactly the same shot, it's exposed just the same, but you have a better quality image because you've narrowed down your aperture a wee bit and your ISO is the lowest it can go, okay? So, is everyone okay with that? So, if you're changing your aperture, just as an idea for like when you're translating across, if you stop down your aperture by 1 f number, okay, so if you increase your aperture by 1 f number, it will halve your shutter speed, okay? So, if you go from f2 to f4, then that would be the equivalent to going from 1/400 to 1/200. Okay, so every stop is equivalent to halving the amount of light coming into the camera, okay? And in the same way, when you're changing your ISO as well, it will work the same way, it will halve your shutter speed, okay? So ISO generally goes in 100 or 200 increments. It usually is a rule of doubling. So some will go like 320 and stuff like that, but it really depends on your camera. So ideally, you want to have the ISO as low as possible, aperture open, stop it down when you're actually happy with your shot, and then just increase or reduce your shutter speed to compensate for the changes you've made, okay? So everything balances out, right? If you want more light, you want a wider aperture and a lower shutter speed and a higher ISO. If you want less light, you're going to want to narrow your aperture, increase your shutter speed, or decrease your ISO. Is everyone happy with the balance of that? Okay, so that's that side of things. That's pretty much the end of the actual sort of theoretical content of the panel. I've got a couple of general tips to share. When you're using a flash, if you're doing it in manual mode, then obviously it's quite difficult to figure out what settings you need and things like that, okay? When I was first getting the hang of doing flash photography, when I was using my SLR, I found it quite difficult to do. I had a lot of very overexposed shots as a result. I found that generally you want to set the shutter speed as high as you can, okay? Just to avoid completely whiting out the shot. And then you can just start stopping down your aperture to halve the amount of light coming in. And then that way you can get it to the right level of exposure. If it's still too dark, even when you've done all of these settings, you can just open your aperture wider to compensate. So the aperture, changing the aperture by a few f numbers will actually make quite a big drastic difference to how light or dark your shot is. So if you're fairly happy with your shutter speed settings and the quality of the picture you've got, then stopping up and stopping down is a great way of dealing with changing light conditions. So you're outside doing a shoot, and then the sun goes behind a cloud, and you're like, oh man. So all you need to do is just stop down or stop up a little bit to compensate for these changes in the lighting conditions. Okay, so that's that side of things. Using a tripod, as I was saying before, if you've got a tripod, you don't have to worry about camera shake, okay? So put your ISO as low as possible to get a nice quality image, because if you're working in dark conditions, noise shows up 20 million times more than it does when you're working in other conditions, okay? So you want your ISO as low as possible, and then you just lengthen the shutter speed instead, because you're not touching the camera, you can have it there for as long as you like, fantastic. The one suggestion I would make, if you're doing night shots like this one here that I took in Toronto, if you use the self-timer option on your camera, most of them have a 2-second option on them. If you use that, then you can press the shutter button and then step away, and then the shutter will open without you actually touching the camera at the same time. And then that way you don't have to worry about accidentally moving the camera when you go to actually press the shutter button down. So that's that side of things. White balance is a really, really important thing that will make a huge difference to the quality of your pictures, okay? On entry-level DSLRs like this one here, the auto white balance setting is not fantastic, okay? On this camera in particular, all of the auto white balance shots I had a slight yellow cast to them, okay? So ideally you want to set your white balance to a custom setting, okay? So for example, if you're taking pictures indoors, they're always going to have a little bit of a kind of sodium yellow cast to them unless you use the tungsten white balance setting, which will give everything a nice white kind of colour, and it will even things out nicely, okay? It is honestly amazing how much of a difference it makes So try it out. I would highly recommend it. Even on your digital camera, you'll have the option of changing the white balance on it. On DSLR cameras, with your white balance, this is an entry-level DSLR, so I'm hoping that you guys will have access to the same settings. If you take a picture and you're not happy with the colour cost to it, you can actually change it on here. Okay, so this is my custom white balance setting for cloudy days. It gives a nice sort of warm touch to the picture. Okay. It was actually a fairly sunny day when I took this, but the light was such that the white balance setting for that made it look really lovely. So what you can do is you can actually change the magenta, the blue, and the reds and the green contents of your white balance settings to compensate for any changes in the cast of the image. Okay, so colour cast is basically, you know, when you have old film and it goes kind of out of date, and you get all the funky colours on it and stuff like that, or even on old pictures that have already been printed and they go slightly red over time, that's called colour cast. And film had a huge problem with that because every film was made slightly differently. So Kodak always had like a bit of a green cast to it and things like that. But your camera does the best it can to interpret the colours and the different wavelengths of light that come into it. But it won't always get it right, and you will sometimes have to make those changes to your white balance settings in order to compensate for that. Okay? So changing your white balance to a proper setting for the conditions that you're shooting in will make a big difference to the quality of your pictures. Highly recommend it. If you wear spectacles, all DSLR viewfinders have a dioptric setting on it. Okay, mine's on the top here. Canon's are a little wheel on the side. What happens with this is that it actually changes the lens strength of your viewfinder. Okay, I have mine ramped right up to the right hand side because I'm short-sighted. Okay, if I have this knocked off even a little bit, my viewfinder is completely blurry and I can't see a thing. So if you find that it's a little bit difficult to actually tell whether your picture's in focus or not, try fiddling with that, it might make a difference. So that's that. And lastly, it is just honestly a case of practice. So use your camera as much as you can. If you are only using your camera at conventions, you will not get enough practice to get good at using it. Okay. Ideally, you want to just take pictures when you're out and about. If you're away on holiday, if you're out for a walk. The picture on the beginning of these sets of slides I took when I was walking to work. So just use your camera as much as you can. Honestly, anything can be a picture. And the more you use your camera, the more proficient you'll get at setting these ISO, aperture, shutter speed, etc. You've got the whole weekend, rest of the weekend ahead of you to have a go at all of this sort of thing. So honestly, the more you use it, the better you will get at actually just being like, right, okay, it's a little bit overcast, I'll just go for 1/200 and I'll set my aperture at about f4. Or something along those lines, okay? Everyone's cameras are slightly different. The metering systems inside them will always pick a slightly different exposure for your shot, okay? My camera has the option to meter. I do use it sometimes if I'm looking for a quick shot, but I do tend to find that when you set it to meter, it will always slightly overexpose your shot. So if I'm metering, I will meter and then stop down by a little bit in order to compensate for that. So if you're using the automatic settings on your camera or you're on P mode, get a feel for what kind of picture it takes. If you just find that it's consistently over or underexposed, you can then alter your aperture to compensate or just change your shutter speed. The only other thing I really would say is your camera will have a lot of individual customizable settings on it. It's definitely worth sitting down and going through them and just putting them to the things that you prefer, okay? For example, if you have it just set to automatic, for green mode for example, the vast majority of DSLR cameras will always just meter the entire shot, okay? So when I say metering, what it will do is it will have a look at the amount of light levels across different parts of the sensor, and it will then calibrate shutter speed and aperture to compensate for that. But if you meter it across the entire shot, if you have a very uneven set of light sources, say for instance you're shooting somebody here in that corner, and then you've got a big bright window on the right hand side, it won't be exposed properly because your camera will just meter for the entirety of the image rather than just the bit that you're actually pointing the camera at. And as a result, it'll go, oh, there's a big bright thing here, that means that the overall light in this image is quite a lot. I'll just massively change my shutter speed to compensate for that, and you end up with a really overexposed image. Okay, so there is an option to do what's known as spot metering. Okay, what it looks like on your camera settings is there will be a set of brackets, okay, and there will be a circle in the middle that's filled in. Okay, if it's metering across the entire shot, then the individual halves of the brackets will be coloured in as well. But if you set it to spot metering, then it will only measure the amount of light from the centre of the sensor rather than across the entirety of the sensor, and that will change the exposure of your shot and it will make it a lot more accurate. Does anyone want to know about histograms? It is actually an option on your camera. You can get it to show the histogram after you take a picture. It's a slightly more advanced thing. Okay, histograms are the way that the camera measures how much light there is in the image. Okay, so you've all seen histograms. It is essentially, if there is no light in an image, then the histogram will be level like that. Okay, if there's a particular amount of light in one area of the sensor, then it will show as a peak. Okay, so if you have the histogram option enabled on your camera, you can actually tell if the image is correctly exposed by looking at the histogram itself. If it's fairly even all the way across, then it's evenly exposed. If you have a big bunch of spikes here and no spikes on the other side, then that means it's not properly exposed and you need to change your settings. Okay, that's kind of the layman's coverage of that. Like I say, there are a lot of different options on your camera that you can use to give you more information about the shot that you've just taken. I would advise you to keep track of what apertures you're using, because you'll find eventually that you just end up using the same ones over and over again. So if you say, oh, I'm really happy with that shot, what was your aperture? Because if you're really happy with it, then chances are you can use that again and just tweak your shutter speed to compensate. Okay, so that's pretty much it really. Any questions at all? Does anyone want to know about like buying lenses or things like that?
Just wondering, is there any particular special techniques to deal with fixed aperture lenses? Because I've got a zoom lens here which is basically fixed to f4.
Oh, is it stuck?
No, it's literally, that's what it's designed in.
Oh, okay. If you're stuck with that aperture, then you've got a couple of different options available to you. You can just use your camera on AV mode, that's an option, and then that way it will just automatically set your shutter speed and ISO to compensate for the fixed aperture. Let's have a look.
Well, it's specifically bought it because the fixed aperture provides for some very useful and interesting effects in artistic effects in portrait photography, but I figured I might as well ask if there's anything you can do.
Well, if you're working at f4 all the time, then the advice is pretty much, you're kind of stuck with your lens wide open really, so you're always going to have a depth of field effect. So your background's always going to be fairly blurred, so you need to kind of bear that in mind when you're shooting.
That's kind of why I bought it.
Yeah, if you want a nice bokeh, etc., then yeah, absolutely. But for the most part, you are just going to want to keep your ISO as low as you can, because it's a fairly long lens, so you're going to get aberrations and things anyway because of the wide aperture. So you want to try and make sure that your image is the best quality it can be. Otherwise, you're just tweaking your shutter speed for the most part. There will be circumstances under which you just can't use it. Because if you can't stop down, then your shutter speed only goes so high. So yeah, that's that. Any other questions, Tom? Any other questions at the back now?
More of a comment really. I went the opposite way to the chap over there. I took one with a fixed zoom lens that went down to f1.8.
Yeah, you got to
I
try,
found
yeah?
I had a lot of trouble with low light photography. Either the ISO would go up or the shutter speed would go down, and I'd end up with a lot of motion blur.
Yeah.
And I think just going all the way down to f1.8, as you turn the camera, just don't turn the flash on and do the best you can with low light at f1.8. It just seems to have helped a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes your camera will just select really retarded settings and you just go, why are you doing that? Which is why, if your camera is misbehaving on you, then just put it in manual mode and it will get you where you want to be. If you've got f1.8, then yes, you're going to have a lot of depth of field effect. You are going to have quite a lot of aberrations around the edge as well. But it's when you're buying lenses, there is a lot of debate about what lenses are the best for cosplay photography. Okay, if you go for a prime lens, which is one where you can't zoom, okay, it's just a fixed focal length, then the apertures on them will tend to be smaller. Okay, so the f numbers will go down to a lower amount, so you can open your aperture wider. The advantage of that, obviously, is that you can get really nice depth of field effects, and obviously you can work in lower light. However, the disadvantage of having a fixed focal length is that when you are in a situation where the conditions are constantly changing, you're like, oh, that person over there, I need a picture of them, or there's a big group shot, I need to like stand 20 million metres away from them. That can sometimes be a bit of a disadvantage, not having that flexibility. But the quality of prime lenses compared to zoom lenses is much, much better. And the reason for that simply is because if you are changing focal lengths, you are limited in how many stops down you can go and stops up because of the aberrations that you get in association with having a variable focal length. So yeah, in terms of your settings for that, yeah, ideally you probably want to be, if you're working at f1.8, then you want your ISO as low as possible for the same reasons as before. If you're working in low light conditions, then noise is going to be an issue. So ideally you want a tripod, basically.
Yeah. It's a 50mm, so I do discover a lot if I'm shooting indoors, I can't back up far enough. So you end up with a lot of face shots where you wanted a whole body.
Yeah.
But
so this is a 28mm that I've got on here. It is brilliant for that sort of thing. It's great for architecture, photography and landscapes and things like that as well. If you need to fit everything in your shot, then a lower focal length is a good way to go. However, your kit lens is usually perfectly adequate for the vast majority of applications. Okay, the kit lens that comes with this Pentax is 18 to 55mm. Okay, so that goes from far away to roughly portrait. Okay, I do have a zoom lens, but they're not really that helpful for cosplay photography, particularly in masquerades where camera shake is a massive issue. So yeah, it's. When you have these kinds of cameras, it is tempting to just get loads of lenses, but really you will find that you just have a core set that you will just take everywhere with you, because they are the ones that are the most useful. The other lens that I've got, that is, has it finished doing the rounds? Who's got it? Oh, it's just there, brilliant. This one's 40 to 80mm, so this neatly covers what that doesn't. So essentially, the lenses you buy, you should always do your research, because there are a lot of different lenses out there and some of them are crap. So if you find a lens that you like the look of, then make sure that you have a look online, see what other people think of it. It's usually somebody who's taken it out for a test run and has provided some shots for you to have a look at. Okay? Buying second-hand lenses can be a bit of a minefield, so I would highly recommend going online and having a look and seeing what's out there. All of the lenses I have are all manual focus only, because they are all old lenses for the original DSLR cameras. I buy these because they're durable, they handle a lot of abuse, but at the same time, digital lenses, you can get a lot of really nicely made ones as well. But one thing I would say is buy UV filters for all of your lenses. Okay? UV light does a lot of damage to camera lenses over time. Okay, they will go a bit cloudy. So ideally you want to protect your camera lenses because you've spent a lot of money on them. So yeah, buy UV filters. They're not that expensive, really, like £6-7 a pop. It's worth it to get the mileage out of your lenses for the money you've paid for them. Well, I say money you've paid for them, that one cost me £12.50, but never mind. Is anyone wanting any more advice on filters and stuff like that? Do any of you actually have any filters?
I've got one at home, but I'm not sure if it's really what really marketed it as a polarizer.
Polarizing filters reduce reflections. So if you are taking pictures of people in front of glass windows, or if you have people who wear glasses, things like that, polarizing filters are great for that sort of thing. The actual original purpose of them is that they filter out certain wavelengths of light, and they will really blue up the sky, blue up oceans and things like that. You can get circular polarizers, and you can get just like horizontal or vertical, etc. Circular ones, you have to rotate them to get the picture actually looking nice. You're looking through the viewfinder and rotating your polarizer. If you ever want to do cosplay photography shots outdoors, it's definitely worth picking one up. For the most part, the vast majority of filters are not actually that useful when you own a DSLR. Okay. I do own a red filter. The reason I own that is because when you're shooting in black and white, it can make a difference to the quality of your shot. It'll bring out certain colours more, because obviously black and white doesn't matter if you've got a red filter in front of it. Okay, so that one's, again, they're only a couple of quid on eBay, and it's worth picking one up if you want to play around with these settings a bit. So that's filters. The main one's the UV one, really, because it is a protecting thing for your camera. The other thing I would say as well is that, does anyone have dedicated photography insurance? No. It's definitely worth investing, because you never know when something terrible might happen to your camera. Ayacon, who was doing the cosplay posing panel with me yesterday, he had his camera stolen one expo from Fox's. He was lucky enough that he lived at home and was covered by his parents' contents insurance, but if you are out and about and something terrible happens to your camera, or you've mounted it on the tripod and you haven't secured it properly and it falls on the floor, like what happened to me a couple of years ago, you can insure your camera for £20 a year. And that covers you against theft, accidental damage, etc, etc. It's definitely worth doing, because if you are planning to use your camera a lot in order to get better at using it, you paid 300, 400 quid for it. Yeah, £20 a year, it's not really that much. And if it gives you a bit of peace of mind so that you've got more confidence in taking your camera out and about, it's worth doing. Otherwise, really, it's just a case of everyone's camera is slightly different and will work in a slightly different way. I don't use Canon or Nikon. I can't give you much in the way of advice on recommended settings for those cameras, but in general, if your camera has a tendency to over or underexpose, then you can just tweak your settings to compensate, and, like I say, have a look around in your customizable settings and see what you can get away with. Any other questions at all? That's us then. Thanks very much.